Welcome to another poetry deep dive today. I love Denis Martindale. He has written over 3,700 poems for the Poem Hunter website. This time, Denis Martindale has written a Star Trek poem. The poem explains the character Captain Jean-Luc Picard, famously played by Patrick Stewart. We are introduced to a very powerful character called Q as the judge of mankind. The TV episode Encounter at Farpoint includes the captain's command catchphrase, "Make it so," and this is the title of the poem. Here's what the poem's message shares with us today.
Okay, let's just pause for a second here. Before we even look at the verses, we have to appreciate the sheer volume of work we're dealing with. Over 3,700 poems. I mean, that is literally a monumental achievement. Denis Martindale has spent a profound amount of time exploring the human condition through verse. But what happens when a prolific poet turns his artistic lens onto a massive science fiction legend? Well, he deconstructs the icon. He looks right past the shiny Starfleet uniform and the pristine bridge of the Starship Enterprise to find the complex, beating heart of a man carrying the weight of the entire galaxy.
So here's our roadmap for today's explainer. First, we'll meet the Serene captain. Second, we're diving into the true burden of command. Third, we'll look at Q and humanity's trial. And finally, we'll wrap up with the wisdom that spared mankind. Let's jump right in.
All right, Section 1, meet the Serene captain.
You know, when we first picture Captain Jean-Luc Picard, we instantly see this pillar of absolute stability, right? And the absolute definitive symbol of that serene leadership is his legendary phrase, "Make it so." You'll even find it topping lists on places like WikiQuotes. In the poem's opening, Martindale paints this exact picture: Picard sitting in his command chair, serene, in charge, and oh so wise. That's why they placed him there. It's concise, it's commanding, and honestly, it gives off this illusion that controlling every high-stakes scenario is as effortless as just uttering 3 simple words.
But here's the catch. The poem immediately pulls back the curtain on a much darker, heavier reality. It says by simply saying, "Make it so," despite the aftermath. Now that word right there, aftermath, that is crucial. That outward serenity completely masks the absolute chaos happening out in the void of space. The poem reminds us that weapons are fired and conquest after conquest marches on, like frowns upon his face. The command itself is simple, sure, but the real-world consequences, they are deeply complex and, a lot of times, totally destructive.
Which brings us to Section 2, the true burden of command.
Now we're stepping past that polished, public-facing veneer of the captain's chair and getting into the private, silent moments of the man himself. It's this brilliant look at the duality of leadership. On side A, we have the public Picard, serene, in charge, super wise. But flip to side B in the next stanza, and we see a guy who is weary of the chase. We see him dealing with love affairs gone wrong and suffering from a lack of sleep at the end of days that left him weak, not strong. It's a total deconstruction of this superhero captain, because even the greatest leaders get completely depleted. Having to make it so, day in and day out, that takes a massive, deeply personal toll.
But here is where the resilience comes in. Martindale writes, "Picard pressed on despite each loss, each cross he had to bear, a rolling stone that had no moss, he traveled here and there." Do you see how he connects Picard's wild sci-fi adventures to the completely universal human experience of carrying heavy responsibilities? We all have crosses to bear, right? And Picard, he doesn't just issue orders from the safety of his comfy chair. The poem explicitly notes that sometimes he fought the enemy face to face with death, instead of just whispering a catchphrase on his breath. He's literally right there in the trenches with his crew.
And just look at how this builds across the entire timeline of the franchise. This burden wasn't just a one-off bad day, it was a lifetime of service. Martindale frames this poem around a massive journey, one that kicks off way back with the TV episode Encounter at Farpoint, stretches all the way through the epic Star Trek films, and goes right into the twilight of his life in the TV series literally titled Picard. For decades, you guys, this character has been carrying the moral and physical weight of the entire universe on his shoulders.
So that leads us to a pretty terrifying question. When one man carries the weight of humanity's actions, who ultimately judges man's history? I mean, if Picard represents the absolute best of us, what happens when the very worst of us is put on trial?
Let's find out in Section 3, QAnon and humanity's trial.
This is where the poem totally shifts gears. We go from a deeply personal character study into a massive, high-stakes cosmic courtroom drama. Enter Q. He's this practically omnipotent being who just shows up on the Enterprise to act as the literal judge of mankind. And honestly, Q's charges against us are devastatingly accurate. He points straight at man's history of wars. He points out the tragedy where each good man dies. He flat out calls our collective violent history an awesome travesty. So Q forces the Enterprise, and Picard by extension, to prove that humanity is actually worth keeping around. They have to demonstrate their absolute best to outweigh a really dark historical record.
So how exactly does a weary starship captain fight an all-powerful god? Well, not with weapons, and definitely not with a catchphrase. The poem tells us the captain pleaded in that court the right to coexist. It says that in that single precious thought, Q's judgment day was missed. It was Picard's desperate, incredibly eloquent plea for our right to just exist alongside the stars that managed to hit pause on our destruction. Even though, as Martindale is quick to note, Q persisted in his quest to teach them a thing or two, forcing the Enterprise crew to constantly prove their worth in everything they did.
And that brings us to our final section, Section 4, the wisdom that spared mankind. All right, so we've seen the Serene captain, we've felt his exhaustion, and we've watched him stand up in defense of our entire species. And that brings us to the absolutely magnificent conclusion of Denis Martindale's 2016 poem. Listen to this. Thank God the captain's wisdom spared mankind more than we know, much more than all the times he cared when saying, "Make it so." The biggest takeaway from today's explainer is right there in those lines. As iconic as "Make it so" is, it was ultimately just a tool of command. What truly mattered, what literally saved humanity from cosmic doom, was Picard's deep, profound wisdom. It was his empathy, his core philosophy, and his ability to see the real value in humanity despite all of our flaws. That right there, that is his true superpower. I want to leave you with one final thought today. We all have moments, right? Moments where we have to slap on a brave face, sit in our own figurative captain's chairs, and say, "Make it so," just to get through the day. So, what heavy responsibilities do you navigate with your own "make it so"? And when you do you lead with just authority, or do you lead with the kind of deep wisdom that can uplift and spare the people around you? Definitely something to chew on as you go through your week. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer of Denis Martindale's fantastic work. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and I will see you next time.